All right, we're getting right into it on Golden State Hoop. Let's hit the death lineup immediately because the big news is that the Warriors were not able to trade for Giannis Antetokounmpo. Nobody was, by the way. Milwaukee was the flirt of all flirts, and then at the end was like, "No, we're good. We're keeping him. We'll figure it out in the summer." And then I saw Giannis texted or he put something on Instagram about um, attracting people to Milwaukee instead of being attracted to other places. So after all is said and done, we talked about this all last week. The pipe dream, which I think was super realistic, but at least being mentioned in the whole thing was fun for a little bit. But ultimately, they did not get him, and I think while I want the Warriors to be involved in these kinds of discussions, you do feel a little bit like, well, we put all of our hope and prayers into one thing. That thing didn't happen. And then you feel deflated after. We'll talk about who they actually did trade for in a second. But ultimately, the Giannis, all the noise, all the discussions, it came to nothing. What is your feeling of it as the trade deadline passed?
Yeah, I mean, it was always more likely to not happen than, to happen. I there's all those what's it, like the poly market and the Kalshi where it feels like you can like a prediction market that you can bet on anything and like the stuff's weird, but like it was always, it's always more likely that the superstar player stays, at at their current place. And I think I want to say it was last podcast that you can kind of compare it to Dame Lillard where it's like he wants to stay in Portland. He wants to stay in Milwaukee, but the team's just not competitive. So he felt like he needed to go somewhere else, but he also doesn't want to disappoint the hometown crowd. And I don't know. I felt like it was, it's not just a Milwaukee Bucks thing. I think it was also very largely a Giannis thing where he was kind of flip floppy. And, he thought he was ready to move and he thought he was ready to go to a new team, but, he's been in Milwaukee his whole career. And I think although, Milwaukee didn't like the offers that presented to themselves but Giannis himself did not say that he wanted to go to a specific team, and I think that complicated things. And I think that the Giannis rumors from Shams don't just come out of thin air. The report was, I literally have it right here. The report was two-time MVP Giannis Antetokounmpo is ready for a new home at the February 5th NBA trade deadline, and that was reported on January 28th. So that doesn't just come out of thin air unless Giannis himself sends it to Shams or Shams gets it from Giannis's camp. So I think that Giannis being flip-floppy is probably to be expected a little bit, but also a little annoying and in a tease at the end of the day. But again, not likely that the Warriors were going to end up with him. Although it was looking good in terms of the chances with against the other teams, but overall it's more likely that he was going to stay in Milwaukee, and that's what happened. So yeah, this season is kind of it was relying on a Giannis sized move to remain relevant and try to compete. And now that that's gone, I think we're back at the same place we were once Jimmy went down, and it's essentially the season's kind of over. And yeah, what else are you going to do?
So the flip side is you run it back. You just go, okay, we're not making any moves. And you do what Milwaukee did with the, which is let's see if we get some better offers in the summer. And we thought that's what the Warriors were going to do with Jonathan Kuminga, but they did not do that. They traded Jonathan Kuminga and Buddy Hield for Kristaps Porzingis. This Kristaps Porzingis has played 59 games in the last 2 years, is currently out because of an injury and an illness. Now, I know the latest report, Anthony Slater said that he still has to go through the Rick Celebrini physical, but the idea is that maybe he would be available this Sunday against the Lakers.
Mhm.
And by the way, we don't usually record on game day, but the outcome of tonight's game against Phoenix is like almost unimportant compared to the
Yeah,
news. So that's why we're recording.
right.
So what do you think about the Warriors' decision to trade Kuminga now instead of trying to recoup something in the summer, maybe trying to utilize his upping his trade value like we talked about a couple weeks ago?
I don't know. I kind of think this was realistically that the most. I didn't think they were just going to get anything from him. Like I kind of just thought he was a salary filler, and for the Giannis thing, like it's hard to even convince yourself that like he was a prominent piece to that trade. Like he had no value. It was essentially the Wiseman thing, where it's the Wiseman gets flipped for 4 seconds, that gets flipped for GP2. It's like that's the trajectory this was heading in this whole time. And Kerr said it perfectly, where it's like they were trying to win, and his development got stalled because of it, and it's just kind of the situation they were in. Nothing against Kuminga, and that's the situation they were in. And now he goes to an Atlanta team that, quite frankly, I don't think he fits on that much. But um, I just think that that was kind of the story, is like that would be what our podcast was about every single week. And in the free agency, it was every single week it was about Kuminga. And then the Warriors started off kind of nice, and then but once they started stalling again, then our podcast kind of became about, oh, how are they going to flip this Kuminga salary? If they didn't trade him, that's what our podcast was going to be about every single time, was, oh, is Kuminga's trade value going? I'm happy he's gone. I don't want to talk about this guy anymore.
The content, though, what about the content?
Screw the content, man. This guy's been annoying. Not his fault, but it's too
By the
much.
way, we might have a better content idea though, because your video of who can beat UConn is like the fourth most viewed thing that we've ever done. So it's kind of funny.
This is like 30 seconds at the end of a podcast.
I actually I got 3 minutes out of it, man.
Oh,
Okay, so the idea of bringing Porzingis on feels a lot like the trade for Chris Paul. In hindsight, the
it
trade
does. Yep.
for Chris Paul, because at the time we thought maybe they were going to be able to do something with him or with that contract, and they didn't. He just left. They couldn't do anything with it, and so now with this Porzingis deal, it's an expiring. So
Mhm.
it almost feels like you traded Kuminga and Buddy Hield just for $30 in contract in space. Now,
30 million.
yeah, 30 million. Now, the Buddy Hield contract, in hindsight, they're getting out of that thing because they would have had a couple more years with him, I think.
I will say there was a partial guarantee on it that I learned about yesterday that I did not. In my head, I think Kuminga was at 22, Buddy was at 9. Buddy had another year at 9, and then the following year was at 10 with a player option. There was a $3 million partial
Mm.
guarantee that if they waived him, that as late as the day after the draft, that he would only be on the books for $3 million, and then he'd be waived. So that's probably what they were going to do. So essentially, all you're doing is saving $3 million, because that Kuminga and Buddy salary was basically the same of the Kristaps salary. So essentially, you're just saving yourself $3 million next year, because that you would have cut him before that partial guarantee.
So trading Kuminga and Buddy Hield for free agency cap room is what it
Right.
looks like, because now we'll see if Porzingis plays. Like I said, the report is that he is going to play, but if he hurt or if they decide that they're not going to bring him back, then it's a giveaway. It's you're trading Kuminga and Buddy for nothing, essentially, just for space
Right.
on the cap. So
$3 million. That's it.
that if you look at the trade from that perspective, it does look like a washing their hands with Kuminga. Now, let me read the Kerr quote that you actually talked about. Kerr said, I think it was a tough situation for everybody, given how raw he was when he got here and given we were still playing for championships. He needed the runway to make more mistakes. He needed the experience of being in the NBA and understanding what it was about. For him, it was very tough not being allowed to make those mistakes. For us as a staff, it was tricky trying to develop him while we were trying to win. I think it's as simple as that. Everybody liked him. I liked him. He's a really good guy, very personable, well liked in the locker room, just a tough fit. You know, I buy that. I buy that Steve Kerr believes that. There were some very though. When you talk about we couldn't we didn't give him the space to make mistakes. Why not? Because the Warriors were very average in some of those seasons, or straddling the line between average and possibly decent. but there were some stretches, man, where they were not playing very well. And so I understand it because I think Steve truly believes that, but I don't think that this team was winning 50 games every year to where you're worried about, the difference between a second seed and a fifth seed. Like these there were moments where these guys were struggling to make the play in. So, and again, in hindsight, it doesn't feel like it was always that cutthroat.
Yeah, and I know that's something we've talked about, and unfortunately, Anthony Lamb is always the name I could think of because I remember saying, like, what's the difference if they gave Anthony Lamb a lot of run, and he did quote unquote the things that Kerr likes, where it's kind of a hustle guy and knows how to get the ball to Steph. What's the win loss difference if you had just never played Anthony Lamb and instead Moses got those minutes, or instead Kuminga got those minutes? Is it the difference of 4 games? Is it that, like, what realistically is the difference? And I know we debated that and we didn't really come to like a clear difference, but I think we both thought that it wasn't by that many games. So in that regard, maybe they should have played him more. And it's always going to be a what if, because I think there were moments even with Kerr where it's like, okay, that's what made you, sit him. Like, sure, I get that the style doesn't fit, but like there were games where it looked right, and then that's why you sit him. But at the end of the day, Steve Kerr is not perfect, but he is a winning coach. He's a playoff coach. He's not a developmental coach. Like, he came into the Warriors with championship aspirations. Like, there are coaches that are there for the developmental process, and then they'll go to the playoff coach once they feel like they've reached that status, and they'll go hire someone else. Steve is not a developmental coach. You've said it too, where he's really good on a game to game level in a playoff series of making the adjustments to make them,
That that's what
have the edge in that playoff series.
That's what they were going to be this year. The bet was that in a 7-game series, they would be able to figure it out. But in an 82-game season, they're so old that the biggest worry is just making sure that they have those guys ready by the end of the season. Now, with Jimmy out, like, I think that's out of it. Like, they just don't have the talent to do that. But that was your bet, and that was always going to be our bet. And why? Because they did it year after year. They went into Sacramento and won game 7.
Mhm.
They went into Houston and wrapped up that series. So that is actually data, right? That is proof there. But the 82 game season and the hurdles and the ups and the downs, that has not been their forte in the last several years. And having to always look at the trade deadline to be your solution is not always the greatest thing to, it's not the greatest thing for organizations is to go, oh my gosh, we got to come up with some miracle at the trade deadline in order to be the team that we want to be. Like, where, you know, you should have these moments where you're bringing up the young guys, to be better players, and then you're bringing in your D'Anthony Meltons to help your team, and then you if you need that Hail Mary player, you have the draft capital or the pieces to do that, and they never seem to always have those things connect in one place. And like you've said, the actual you know these players better piece of it, the young players, that just has not been there these last several years.
Right, and I agree, because if they had taken the 82 game season more seriously, and there's only a certain extent that you can take it seriously, when in reality it's just you have these older players and you're not willing to play the younger players and develop the younger players. So, you end up as a 6th to 9th seed every season. And so, like, what if, the regular season was uh, you know, a better outcome? They took advantage of it more. Maybe you don't go to 7 against Sacramento. Maybe the first series is against a more favorable. Well, Sacramento was probably the best team to play against in that series, in that um, year. But you
Similarly,
get a better.
Houston was the best team last year too.
Yeah, I guess I don't entirely know where I'm going with this point. So I guess I'll switch it up in the idea of, like, yes, but I think it's more of an ownership front office miscalculation where Bob Myers, and it seems like a heavy influence from Joe Lacob, went against the sauce. They went against what was working, and they thought that the dynasty years were over. And so they tried to go for potential projects Wiseman, Kuminga, Moody. Those are the three you can look at and say those were the high upside guys that, because they thought the dynasty was over.
Don't forget about Trey Lance. Oh, that's the other Bay Area team.
Ah, Joey Bart or
Yeah, Joey Bart.
Luciano.
This is a
But
bad area for developing talent, man.
yeah. Yeah, but I think what I was gonna say is it was a miscalculation there because, they thought the dynasty era was over, and they went for these project players when, it always gets called back to, well, you know, Halliburton was someone who Kerr liked, and they could have gotten him in a later pick. Franz was someone Kerr liked. Trey Murphy, just like these guys who would have fit the sauce, who would have fit what they've been doing historically, that, they went against their guns and went for these project players, and they have a playoff coach that is just like, you could have maybe seen some of this stuff coming. I don't think you could have seen how bad Wiseman ended up being. Like, that's a little unlucky.
Yeah,
I don't think you
that
could
poor
have
dude.
seen.
That is just
Yeah,
unfortunate how his career has ended up. Like, it's just like that's
yeah,
like you roll the dice 10 times, and, like, that's the worst dice roll that could happen, and that's actually what his career turns into be.
right. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, I kind of put some. Although I know Kerr's imperfect and he's not, doesn't make all the right calls, but I think that, something I always say, I feel like in maybe a leadership position is KYP, know your personnel. And I think as a GM, as an owner, you should have known that, Kerr is not going to put in the time to develop these players. He's going to rock with what's been working because they have won 3 championships, prior to 2022, when all those picks were being selected. You have 3 championships, you have one of the best players in the league. I would have went for, guys who could have helped the current system instead of trying to, like, half in, half out of what, was working and what the sauce is. And I think the 2022 championship should have been like the indicator of, like, okay, we still got it. Like, imagine the value of Kuminga in 2022, the value of Wiseman in 2022. Like, you would have gotten a lot more return back, but the Warriors have a problem, I feel like, with acknowledging a sunk cost, and they'll just keep letting it sink and sink and sink. And then at some point you just cut your losses. But, you see some of these other teams like Chicago, like Detroit. This was, year 3 of the Jaden Ivey experiment, and it kind of just got hurt for a year, and another better player replaced him, and they cut their losses quick. Jared McCain, year 2, 76ers. Jared McCain was a top 3 rookie of the year guy for, like, the first 2 months of basketball, and then he was out for a season-ending injury. They get VJ Edgecombe, and they go, okay, Maxey and Edgecombe, those are our guards of the future. McCain's really good, but, like, he could just dwindle on the bench and lose value, or we get back a first-round pick now. Like, that's what I like. Like, get although that's not the insanely high value, it's more than. I don't think you get a pick from Kuminga. You don't get a first round pick at all for Kuminga. You got expiring money, which isn't, the worst, but could have been better. And
How
I
but
think you see all
how
these teams
much
kind of cutting their losses
how much of that,
quicker.
though, holding on to these prospects, how much of that is because you have a hands-on owner who thinks he's a personnel guy?
I'm sure a lot of it is. I think Joe thinks he's money. I think Joe thinks he has the Midas touch, where everything he touches turns to gold, and that for sure could be a problem. And I can understand how that could be a problem, but isn't the role of the GM to, like, kind of try to play to both sides, owner and coach, and ultimately do what you want to do? Like, isn't that supposed to be the makings of a good GM? And how Bob, was really good with relationships, not as good of a transactional based guy. But I don't know. I think Dunleavy has been, if you look at all of his transactions, I can go through this really quickly. He's been a guy who hasn't taken a swing.
Mhm.
And it's something I've judged because I have a lot of Kings friends. And it's something I judged previous Kings general manager, Monty McNair, with, was that you look at his draft history, and although he had some good picks, it was all very safe. It was, all these older players. Tyrese Halliburton, big, awesome pick. He was a junior. The Kings had missed out on so many of these project-based 19-year-olds that they were like, okay, now that we got this new GM in, like, let's go for these older picks. So it was Halliburton, it was Davion Mitchell, it was Keegan Murray, it was Devin Carter. And the consistent thing with those guys is that they're all like 22 years old coming into the league. So you didn't want to go for these busts. You wanted to go for these guys who could, contribute right away. And essentially, Dunleavy's did the same thing. His draft history is Pajemski, Trace Jackson Davis, Quentin Post, Alex Tui, Will Richard. I like a good amount of those picks. And I actually do think that those picks are more recognizing that, hey, our coach isn't going to play these young players, so let's give him, these players who can play now. I think those have been pretty solid picks, but you even look at, some of the actual trade transactions that he's done. It was, let's get off of Poole. With Draymond and Poole cannot play together anymore. We need to choose one. Let's get off of Poole, and let's get Chris Paul in return. Like that, you kind of had to, right? That's that's not a ballsy move. You had to. With Jimmy Butler, awesome swing as well. Didn't give up anything. There's it's not light years in a way. Like it. I think getting Jimmy Butler is a really good thing, but I think these are almost just like good moves that are almost presenting itself on a platter to him, in my opinion. Like they got Jimmy Butler for nothing. They got off of Kuminga for nothing. They got off of Jordan Poole for nothing.
Jimmy Butler was also like the third scenario that they
Right.
wanted because they didn't get KD, which was number one.
Right.
Okay, you asked me what is the GM's job? For one, to stay employed. That is number one. And that is what this deal reminds me of, which is if you're Dunleavy, this enables you to take another swing in the offseason because you're going to free up money. Or you're going to bring Porzingis back at a more favorable deal and hope that he can actually stay on the court. So you're, in a sense, what Dunleavy is doing with the roster is enabling it to be flexible enough to take another shot. But those shots seem to be getting smaller over the years. Like the window is closing, and thus the opportunity doesn't seem as big as it was, which actually is surprising because this Giannis one did feel really big, but we also didn't really believe that they were in the mix. Really, like it was a fun thing to be a part of. But if you were to ask, gun to head, no, they're not going to get him more than likely. But Dunleavy's doing the, as long as we have an opportunity, I can have an opportunity as well to make some adjustments. He's giving himself time to do something else. But also, that's why I thought maybe Kuminga was going to stay, because you talked about this sunk cost thing, and that is something that they've been really bad at because the owner is just in love with these guys. And so I figured, okay, well, if you want to appease the owner, you keep Kuminga, and then maybe that pushes Steve out the door. And so then maybe that's why you don't keep Kuminga, is just the idea that the risk is maybe Steve does hang on longer if you don't have Kuminga. So there's there's smaller moving pieces to this thing that we'll see happen in the summer. Does that mean Steve's going to stay? If he doesn't stay, would you have rather had Kuminga still on the roster? Like, there's going to be lots of things that we'll be able to talk about when it comes to that. Okay, but before we actually talk, there's a small little WNBA conversation we'll have. But before we get there, do you think Porzingis fits next to Draymond the way that they're trying to sell us that Porzingis could possibly fit next to Draymond?
Yes, but I think it just goes back to like, how do you judge stuff where it's like uncertainty and health status, where it's like it's the same type of uncertainty as like if they got Anthony Davis. It's like, yeah, on paper, sure, like when they're playing, it looks great, but you said, I think Kristaps's game history of the past couple of years, where he's played 17 games this year. He played 40 last year, 50 the year before,
42 last year, I think.
Yeah, so it is just a matter of health. And I mean, I don't know, as a Warriors fan, what I should be rooting for. I mean, obviously, you want them to win, but it's like, do you want Kristaps to play well so that he kind of plays himself out of a potential Warriors contract? Or do you want, like, what do you want? Because he's a unrestricted free agent after this. So I don't entirely know what to be rooting for because if he plays really well and demands a big contract, guess what? I don't want the Warriors paying him. He has injury like history. Like what happens when you pay the guy and then, you just so happen to get him on an Otto Porter Jr. like season where it's like injury, 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 one random good season, injury, 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 injury. And so I don't entirely know what to be rooting for, but I think this is kind of what we've been waiting for a while is like have you ever seen that meme? Well, you're not really into you don't know Pokemon like that, but there was this meme that was like Charmander, Charmeleon, Charizard, the evolutionary chart of one Pokemon, and it was Shengun to Sabonis to Jokic because it's like just the younger versions of each other, but they evolve into the next. And anyways, that's the whole that's like it's like Quentin Post, Kristaps, I don't know, Jaren. I don't know who is the final 3-and-D center, the rim protecting center. But yeah, I think on paper it makes sense, and I could see it like looking good because I think that Horford Draymond connection kind of started to really look good. Although Draymond's offense has been pretty rough lately, but that at least pairing has started to look good, and I imagine that the Draymond Kristaps pairing will undoubtedly look good too if he's healthy and playing. But I'm just conflicted about what I root for as a Warriors fan. If I want him to play himself out of a potential contract, and if he does, then I don't want the Warriors to pay that you know what might be a larger amount. I want is I want of course I want Kristaps to take a pay cut. I want him to be like I have this injury history, and because of that I
His
must take
reality
this
anyways,
$2 million
right?
deal.
It might be his
Yeah.
reality anyways. Like, no matter if he plays well or not, he will be able to pick his 2 for 20 wherever 2 for 25, whatever it actually is. He'll be able to choose the best fit for him, and maybe some of it is where's the best place for my medicals? Like, is Celebrini actually, a good bet for him just to be on the roster with Celebrini, and how Celebrini looks out for the players? Because there is a piece of me that wonders if we're going to see a mini tank, because if you don't have Jimmy and you're waiting for Jimmy to be back by next year, Steph, do you waste a Steph season knowing that they're probably not making the playoffs? Draymond is maybe the single worst really good player when in non-meaningless or in meaningless basketball games. And then Chris,
Mhm.
do you waste the tread on his tires for this season? And do you just are we going to see a lot of BP? Are we going to see a lot of Pods? Are we going to see a lot of Will Richard? Do you just put Al Horford on ice and say, "Hey, man, like if you want to come back next year?" Like I don't know what his option stuff is all about, but we'll have a spot for you because unfortunately we weren't able to run it the way we wanted to, but we'll run it back next year. Um, does Quentin Post
Yeah, I
get
mean,
get
that's
a
something we talked about, right? It's something we talked about before the Giannis potential trade request is that does my question is, I guess, does Steph go for it considering that he could, he's nearing the end of his career and he's playing like an all NBA player? Would he just be down to shut it down and from an accolades perspective just kind of miss out on something like that? I don't know how much that means to him, but I mean this is what we've been frustrated about is that this guy is closing in on the age 40 in like a year or two, and he's playing at a top 10 level, and we're just like, oh, let's give you expiring money and we'll try again in the off season.
well, you know
That's
who the
just
anchor
the
is though.
the overall. Hmm.
It's him being tied to Draymond, right? Like they just this week finally talked about trading Draymond, and Draymond himself is so valuable next to Steph, but I don't imagine he's as valuable next to, you know, another player or another team. Like he's just so valuable in this structure. But I wonder
Hmm.
I wonder what his value is like across the board. Like I wonder if, the Lakers would be like, yeah, Draymond is valuable to us. We would actually give you X for him. It's probably a specific, who Draymond could be very valuable with? Somebody like Ja. Like I think Draymond could actually get something out of Ja just the way that Draymond plays basketball. but who like it could would Draymond be happy playing next to Luca? I can't imagine he would, right? Like someone who's just so ball dominant. Draymond would just end up hanging out in the corner, just like watching threes bounce off the rim and get back on defense. Like that's essentially what he would become. So it is interesting
Mhm.
that, part of the reason I think that they've been unable to reinvent this team is because this Steph and Draymond twosome has just worked so well. And you kind of owe it to both of those guys to keep them happy because of what they've given you in the past. But at the same time, now I was watching this 49ers documentary, Rise of the 49ers. Tom Brady's production company put it together. Lots of Bill Walsh stuff. And Walsh was the proponent of get rid of the guy a year too early rather than a year too late. The Warriors are about 3 years late on Draymond as far as the apex of who he was. Like, on a Bill Walsh-led football team, like, Draymond would have been traded instead of Jordan Poole. Like, that's how Bill Walsh would have handled that situation.
Mhm.
But basketball's a little different, and you just come off of, winning this title, and, Draymond is so smart, and you got Iguodala and veteran-laden, and you wanna make Steph happy. There's only 12, 14 players, 15 players on a team, whereas on football, there's like 70 players. So it's just a little bit different. But, the Warriors are kind of paying for the loyalty and making sure that the Bay Area fans, appreciate their vets. And they have this like San Antonio Spurs model of like Parker, Ginobili, and Duncan all kind of growing old and aging out together. And for that, they were bad for a little bit. That thankfully they had Kawhi. The Warriors just don't have the Kawhi part of it to reinvent the team. So, okay. So we'll just be tracking how this thing goes. If they do tank, this is not going to be very fun to talk about. So I actually hope that they do play some competitive basketball, and maybe they can sneak into the playoffs again. But if Porzingis gets hurt, you're back to 0, and this is where you're just like, okay, maybe we should shut it down. So we'll keep watching that.